Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on all of the major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and on our website, choice360.org. My guest for this series is Dr. Deanna Reeder. Dr. Reeder is a Cree Métis literature scholar. Her latest book is called Autobiography as Indigenous Intellectual Tradition, Cree and Métis Achamisawina, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Dr. Reeder has had an enormous impact on the development and growth of Indigenous literature studies in Canada. She's the current chair of the Department of Indigenous Studies at Simon Fraser University. Since 2007, she's helped build courses and curriculum at Simon Fraser to establish Indigenous studies as a separate discipline from post-colonial studies and Canadian literature. She served as series editor for Indigenous Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University Press from 2010 to 2021, developed workshops on how to teach Indigenous literatures, helped establish the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, co-founded the Indigenous Editors Association, and co-chairs the Indigenous Voices Awards, an awards program for Indigenous writers. I mention all this because the study of Indigenous literature as a distinct discipline that brings with it specific methods of instruction and learning is a comparatively recent undertaking. It was only in 2001, when Dr. Reeder began her doctoral work, that the field began to shift and orient itself toward a more authentic and more broadly recognized scholarly undertaking. In this series, which is provided with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, Dr. Reeder and I have been discussing her research background, her new book, the growth of Indigenous literature studies, and her role in its development. In this third episode, we discuss the many ways in which Dr. Reeder has helped grow the field of Indigenous literature studies. So in 2013, you helped establish the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, ILSA. Why was an organization like this needed at the time? And what did you establish as its mission?
So it was Daniel Heath Justice was at UBC, and he invited a batch of us. And I'm very, very proud we've been in this circle with Sam McKegney and Armand Ruffo and Rick Montour and Renata Eichenbrot, Katie Martin, Joanna Piscanu. And I want to say Warren Carreyrou, I must have been there as well. And we could have added more, but these are just, I think Daniel had just started his CRC and wanted to have us together. And we had been talking for a long time about how being part of conversations of post-colonial literatures, or what used to be called Commonwealth literatures or CanLit, well, these associations didn't offer us enough. And so we gathered together and we actually wrote out a guiding purpose that's on the Indigenous Literary Studies.org website, called Our Guiding Purpose, and it's the governing code. And I'm just going to read it because they even have the board that we sat down and wrote it out together, the picture of the board on the website. And I just love it. It's to honor the history and promote the ongoing production of Indigenous literatures in all forms, to advance the ethical and vigorous study and teaching of those literatures, to reaffirm the value of Indigenous knowledges and methodologies within literary expression and study, to foster respectful relationships within and between academic and non-academic communities, to facilitate mentorship and professional development, and to advocate for responsible institutional transformation. So that was what our conversation was for about 2 days. And I can say out of that grew the association's first conference in 2015 at Six Nations. And it's been really, I think, transformative to the field.
Right. Excellent. So who do you count as ISLA's members? And You mentioned the first conference, but how else has the organization grown since you've started it?
So we have had a lot of scholars who were senior in their fields of maybe Canadian studies or Victorian studies who focus on Indigenous literatures who have joined because they were, this is something they've been waiting for.
Mm.
And so people like Christine Bold, for example, and has, became a member very quickly. But of course, it's this whole new generation of both Indigenous and settler scholars who have been waiting for something to address kind of the obvious lack in the institution. So I wouldn't say we've had a lot of community members join us, but we do have every other year the conference in a community,
Mm-hmm.
and so the first was at Six Nations, and then in 2017 we were at Stalo at Chilliwack on Stalo Nation, and then most recently at the Gabriel Dumont Institute. And so at that point in time, we've always there tends to be the writers in those circles who also join in, and so I think that it's been growing by leaps and bounds, I suppose. Well, I maybe hampered a little bit by COVID, but
Right.
it's everything.
As everything is, yeah. So in a similar vein, and more recently, you helped start the Indigenous Editors Association, and there's a clear professional development purpose at the IEA. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Is there a particularly unique editorial practice needed for guiding, the development and production of Indigenous literature?
Absolutely. So in
Yeah.
2015, I worked with Greg Younging as well as Gregory Schofield and Warren Carreau in the Aboriginal Editors Circle. And this was an amazing thing that went on for 3 years. I was only part of 1 year, so I couldn't make the other two. And
Hmm.
in this case, it was at Winniskawan, and so in Saskatoon. And we had a week. But I mean, our students included the filmmaker Tasha Hubbard, the Jordan Abel, the poet, who at the time was a grad student, and Florine Belmore, a well-known artist, and Rita Bouvier, the Métis poet, Karen Schmann, the editor for Gabriel Dumont Press. So, I mean, these are only just a few names. In other words, I'm saying that we are, we opened the doors to talk about the need for Indigenous editing, and and when we filled up the seats so quickly, because everyone appreciated that even when they were actively involved in the fields themselves, that there was such a lack of Indigenous people on the other side of like within publishing houses,
Hmm.
And so it was actually that exact meeting where we got together at the last day and wrote out a code of, things that were required that Greg put in the back of Elements of Indigenous Style, So it's editing is, I would say, and it's important to keep in mind that the reason why we don't have books by a lot of books, I should say, by Indigenous writers in the 19th and 20th century is because of the hurdles of publishing. That either books were rejected by publishing houses as not, being appropriate, or they were terribly edited, and there's loads and loads of examples of that.
Hmm.
And so there was a kind of a groundswell of realization that we had to change that. It also happened that one of my students is Rachel Taylor, who then went on to be mentored by Greg and went on to do a master's in editing and publishing at SFU. And I think she's the leading Indigenous editor in Canada. And
Hmm.
she basically forced me into this association, because when you're an academic, it's easier to set up bank accounts and to help support and all that kind of thing. And
Right.
so I was joined also by the amazing Jeanette Armstrong and the amazing Megan Sinclair, who we formed the first executive of that year. And it was followed by an amazing group of Indigenous editors out there, most of them who don't have permanent work. Most of them are
Mm.
doing, contract jobs, but I think are if there was a better infrastructure, would be, leaders in the field. So the
Right.
IEA is trying to create that, create those opportunities, and we're getting started.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to something you said real quick in terms of the difficulty that writers were having in getting their works published, and publishers were turning away titles as not being appropriate, as you said. Is that simply because, acquisitions editors weren't really understanding what they were holding in their hands, and so they just turned it away? Or whereas an editor who is sensitive to how indigenous literature is written might have had different thing to say about that.
I mean, when I think about Edward Henneque's career, so he did a lot of writing around 1920 and was
Hmm.
actively pursuing publication with Ryerson Press. He kept getting rejected, constantly. And it wasn't until after his death that Ruth Buck came along and heavily edited some of his work and got that out, but at least got it out. The same thing happened with Mike Mountainhorse. The same thing happened with Joseph Dion. And, same thing happened with Eleanor Brass, although she lived to see it in her old age. She saw her writing happen. So, I mean, why were they being rejected? I mean, I think partly because they were seen as not being good enough,
No.
and and also maybe it didn't fit the kind of narrative that Canadian literature was trying to establish.
Right.
Remember the 70s? Does Canada have a literature? There was a certain kind of appetite for a certain kind of writing, and that didn't include, you know, Indigenous writers, but I think we
Mm.
can say that's changed.
Yeah. Good. But wait, there's more. I'm wondering if you can tell us about the Indigenous Voices Award, which you also had a hand in, starting back in 2017. How's that been going?
Wow, that's been so. Yesterday, we just had our fifth annual IVAs, or Indigenous Voices Awards, and that's been really exciting. I'm looking forward to its, future. But when I look backwards, it all came out of the sort of national wide appropriation debate slash scandal that happened when there was an editor who will remain nameless. Uh, was offered an appropriation prize to anyone who could write in the voice of others, completely ignoring how hard it's been for Indigenous authors to get into publication, and also how long a history there is of non-Indigenous writers writing Indigenous stories. So there are two people, actually, Robin Parker, and in Toronto, and then also Sylvia Morena Garcia in Vancouver, both but tried to do some crowdfunding, and Robin Parker's really took off. It was like she thought she would raise about 10,000 in crowdfunding, and she got like 120,000, and so
Wow.
had to give that money to somebody. And at the time, I was the president of ILSA, and my colleague Sophie was secretary, and then Sam McKigney was president elect, and so we were approached to take this on, and we've since kind of stepped a little bit back between ILSA and the IVAs because people tend to confuse them. And,
Hmm.
and obviously ILSA has been a very, very strong supporter of the IVAs, but the IVAs are really prizes to be given directly to emerging authors. And so that, oh my gosh, what's been so amazing are the people who step up right away. There's a writer, Pamela Dillon, who's been a patron of ours since the very beginning. Penguin Random House came up and sponsored our first couple of galas, and since then, our mentorship kind of activities, and they've been amazing. Douglas and McIntyre just put out a book by Richard Wagamese, a bunch of, he passed away a few years ago, and they put out one of his books, and with the proceeds to go to the IVAs. So there's been this
Nice.
incredible community groundswell to support, but there's also been this incredible explosion of Indigenous talent. Whereas maybe in 2010, you would go to that one famous Indigenous author. Maybe there'd be two, but you know, um, now there's just a generation. And so our first published poets, finalists in year one, were Billy Ray Balcour, Joshua Whitehead, and Neil Campbell. And this is before they were all famous. Actually, Billy Ray made a joke at the gala that he was Indian famous. So he's not only Indian famous anymore, though. And
Right.
and I mean Aviak Johnson, the Inuit writer, and J.D. Curtness, the Francophone Indigenous writer. I mean, it was really amazing. But but since then, several of our finalists and winners have gone on to become bigger, better known. So Cody Catano, for example, has just come out with a book that's been released, and he was one of our authors, an unpublished author in the beginning. So we really feel as though, I don't know, I wouldn't want to say that the IVAs created this, but
Right.
it was exactly at the right moment. And obviously, I think we've helped lift up, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned, the fact that Penguin Random House came in as a sponsor. I mean, have you seen interest from, I guess, larger, more mainstream publishers in this field as a result of the awards and many of the other initiatives you've been part of?
I think there's been a universal.
I don't know if that matters or not, but sorry.
Oh, well, you know what? Support is support. And I think small publishing houses have been really supportive of their authors and trying to work to give them bigger profiles. But of course, bigger publishing houses can do more. So Penguin has decided to support a volume that's going to come out in May of 2023, which is we have Jordan Abel, Carly Baker, and Madeline Redden, who are editing an anthology of the writing from the first 5 years. And so they've been working on it most of this year to just bring us selected voices. We can't include everybody, but so we're trying our best to give a good smattering. And it's going to come out and be launched next May or June, as part of next year's IVAs. But I mean, we're hoping that it makes the IVAs a household name. And I think that's something that a big publishing house can do just because of the distribution channels, right?
Sure. Yeah. You just heard from Dr. Deanna Reeder. Dr. Reeder is the current chair of the Department of Indigenous Studies at Simon Fraser University and author of Autobiography as Indigenous Intellectual Tradition, Cree and Métis Achemisawina, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week for our final episode in this series as we talk about the growing archive of Indigenous writing up to 1992 called The People and the Text. Dr. Reeder will also talk about the next important steps for continuing to evolve and grow the field of Indigenous literature studies.
If we're really going to have Indigenous literature studied in the university, we need a lot more people to be able to teach it. So we really have to expand that base. Right now, it's funny that everything takes its own rhythm. I know that students are fed up with never having had an Indigenous prof, and that I've heard in several places kind of students rallying that there must be an Indigenous person hired, and I'm all for that. I've done a lot to support that. But we cannot expand if we only focus on growing Indigenous professoriate. We really need to have every lit scholar capable, in the same way that you would expect a lit scholar to be capable in teaching Canadian lit. You'd have to do the same you'd need the same kind of growth.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.